Welcome to the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. We're going to explore ways to sharpen our diagnostic skills, find learning resources, and hear from experts in the automotive field. This episode is brought to you by AutoRescueTools.com and Isaac Rodell. If you are looking to get into module programming, but you are not sure what kind of laptop you're going to need or how to set it up for programming, Isaac is your guy. He can set up laptops specifically to do control module programming for specific brands with partitioned hard drives and all the software that you're going to need to do this. He also sells key cutting equipment, scan tools, and other diagnostic equipment. I bought some stuff from him in the past and the support is phenomenal. So I highly recommend checking out the website. Again, that's AutoRescueTools.com. The link will be in the show notes. Hey, what's going on, automotive world? Welcome to another episode of the Automotive Diagnostic Podcast. My name is Sean Tipping. I'll be your host once again for this week. You got just me. I'm going to do a couple different things in today's episode. First, I'm going to follow up with a couple of the cars from last week. I've got more concrete conclusions on a couple of those that sort of left hanging because it's in the moment and we needed to do a little bit more. So I'll cover those. And then the other thing I'm going to talk about for the rest of the episode is in regards to the episode last week and some further diagnostics that I've done this week. And there's a bit of a contrast between what you saw in that video and what I've been experiencing this week. And I'll get more into depth in that, but we'll talk about some cars and some challenges that I've had. And again, maybe a little bit of a contrast to what you saw in the video last week, but we'll jump into that. First things first, let's conclude a couple of these vehicles. This will be the Maserati and the Volvo. So if you haven't watched or listened to last week's episode, it was a little different. I took you with me on a day of mobile diagnostics, gave you kind of a preview of the car at each stop, a little bit about each car, and then a summary. Some of the shops were a little bit more difficult because it was a little bit loud, and it's tough recording while you're working. I mean, I got to hand it to all the YouTube guys out there who make really nice, polished videos and do it live while they're working on vehicles. That is not an easy task. I mean, number one, just to film yourself working, to have high quality video, and to edit it and put it all together, that's a ton of work. And it kind of takes you out of your element when you're thinking about recording and everything that goes into that, you know, and just technically speaking, but the amount of, you know, description that you have to do, some narration to what you're doing, right? Like most of the time, I'd say almost all of the time, I'm not talking out loud about what I'm thinking or what I'm doing. And not that that's necessarily a bad thing. It can kind of help you with your process, but I don't do that, and it's an extra step. And then you've got the video and the noises and trying to make money too on top of it. It's a challenging thing. So anyways, got to hand it to all the guys that do that. And so last week's episode was more along the line of what you would see on some YouTube channels. I just thought I'd give it a shot. I did get some positive feedback from the listeners and people on YouTube. They liked it. They enjoyed the kind of version of that rather than just a single case study post diagnostic, like here's what I'm doing in the moment, what I'm thinking in the moment, and the cars. So who knows, might do some more of that in the future. I'm not thinking about, you know, going solely with a YouTube channel. But anyways, two of the vehicles that I looked at, one of them was a 17 Maserati, and this was a crank no start. And it was from the auction. I don't know if I was real clear about that on the video. I had suspicions after the fuse was removed, but it did come from the auction. And it did at some point have a fire under the hood, and there were some melted components. The shop had replaced the engine harness. It was a crank no start. And I did find that the missing fuse for not only the fuel pump, but also the all-wheel drive module. That got us fuel pressure, but it still wouldn't start. And I noticed that the cranking compression sounded really weird. Right side, bank one, passenger side of the engine, didn't have any compression, zero. We stuck a borescope down in there. Valves looked okay. Didn't look like they kissed the piston at all. So I told them, hey, if you guys want to tear into this. And, I got to give the shop credit. I was talking to a couple of people about some of the vehicles that I was looking at. And they were asking me, like, why are these shops taking on these vehicles? They probably shouldn't be. And there is an argument to be made. Like, maybe you shouldn't. Like, honestly, if I was a tech back in the day at Firestone and someone brought in an auction fire Maserati, I'd be like, nah, no thanks. Well, we'll pass on that one and keep doing wheel bearings on Chevy trucks. But there's another side of me, because I get that side of it. And there is a point where maybe you should stay in your lane, if you will, with repair. But there's another side of me that likes to just say yes and then figure it out. And maybe you learn your lesson and you realize, oh, okay, these are not profitable. I don't want to get involved in this. That's kind of the stance I've taken on diesel performance and intermittence and things of that nature. I've tried. Trust me, I've put my time in on that stuff. Found it's not what I want to do. But, maybe something new. I respect someone or a shop who says, yes, I'm just going to dive in and I'm going to see if I can figure it out. And maybe I can utilize resources that I have. And there's just a lot of resources nowadays online, more so than ever. And I'll see if I can work through this. And okay, maybe it'll require some special tooling that I don't have. Maybe I'll have to get access to information that I don't have. I mean, that was the case for me on that Maserati. But I do kind of have just a soft spot in my heart for a shop that just says, yeah, bring it on, let's do it. And that's a couple of these shops I was working with. Anyways, on the Maserati, we got to the point where, hey, you got no compression on this side. It doesn't look like the valves are bent, but it's probably timing related. If you guys want to jump in to the engine, you probably find what's going on. And they did. So I actually was back at that shop a couple days later to diagnose another one that we'll talk about. But it had on the exhaust cam on bank one, where the actuator, the camshaft actuator, the part that phases, bolts onto the front of the camshaft, right? It's got a pin that locks it in place, right? It locks the camshaft and the phaser together once you bolt it down. And then the internals in the phaser will release with oil pressure, and it can phase that cam in relation to the timing chain. But that part of the actuator needs to stay fixed to the camshaft. And that's what that pin's purpose is. Well, where this pin goes into the camshaft is supposed to be a hole that is just about the size of the pin. And it wasn't. It was about almost a ½ inch long. Right. So this pin had all this room to slide back and forth. And at first I was like, well, wait, is this like the pin for the VVT? It's not. That's the pin to lock that phaser into place on the camshaft. And so this thing had worn its way on this camshaft. Now, I don't know how long it was running like this because it wore away a lot of metal. I was really surprised. So it must have been running for some period of time with just a little bit of wear. And this eventually got to the point where there was no compression, which was the state that I found it in. So they need to replace the camshaft. Funny enough, it's like a Chrysler engine. I mentioned in the video, it's a Chrysler and the push button is the same. It's basically a 3.6, not exactly. There are some definite differences and the camshafts don't match up, but they're very, very similar. And they actually had little Chrysler emblems on the cam actuators. So I did get a confirmation of that. I'll try to remember put a picture in the Facebook group because I got a picture of the damaged camshaft and then one that's not damaged, how it's supposed to look. That was that one. On the Volvo, I kind of left the end with a little question mark on the remote and then also on the button on the dash. And I mentioned that the only way I could open the trunk once I fixed the wires was by pulling the handle on the back. But if I would hit the button on the remote or if I'd hit the button on the dash, the trunk wouldn't actually open. Well, it was unlocking. And I did mention, I thought maybe that's how it's supposed to be. I Googled the owner's manual for that Volvo XC60, and that is how it functions when you don't have a power lift gate. That's the key. That's the difference. And I don't think I mentioned it in the video, but that Volvo did not have a power lift gate. It was just, you pull the handle, it has an actuator, and then you have to lift the trunk up, and it's got just regular struts that hold the lift gate up. But when you hit the button on the remote, all it does is unlock the trunk so that you could walk up to it without the key and open the trunk. Same thing on the button on the dash. Those are without the power lift gate. It's different if you have a power one, but without the power lift gate, that's how that functions. So we fixed the problem, and that was the reason they couldn't open it with anything, because the only way that trunk gets opened is with the handle, or if you actuate it with a scan tool like we were doing, which proved that actuator part of it out. It was the handle and that open in the corrosion under the carpet by the front seat. So anyways, that was all fixed. They just had to put it all back together. I am happy to have Automotive Seminars as a sponsor for the show. Now, if you're not familiar, Automotive Seminars is a diagnostic technician training company. They've got a website that there'll be a link to in the show notes. And what they offer is top-notch training to technicians like us in the field. I've been taking their training courses for years and have got a ton of benefit out of it. They've got top-notch instructors, John Thornton, Scott Shotton, Scott Manna, and every other month they've got a 2-night course that you can sign up for. Join in, ask questions, and afterwards, you've paid for the course, you can access a recorded version whenever you want. You can rewatch the class 2 years later in case you wanted some details on it. And that is a fantastic feature. So make sure to check out the website to see what courses they have available and what's coming up in the future. Now, on to what I wanted to talk about this week. And I mentioned the contrast between what you saw in that video and how this week went. And so this was based off of, the reason I'm talking about this is based off of a couple of responses I had to the video, people that reach out to me. And, you know, they were mentioning, wow, you really blasted through a lot of diagnostics in one day. And to be totally honest, for that video, it did go pretty smoothly as a whole. I mean, I had some challenging stuff, but I managed to get through everything in a day. Yeah, a couple of them, okay, let's come back once the shop checks this out. But, you know, I had a pretty comfortable direction on everything and got them going where they needed to. And it, as a whole, was pretty good considering the cars that I had. Now, the reason I wanted to touch on this is that is 100% not how it goes for me every day. That one just sort of worked out that was the day that I picked. I just saw a lot of diag on the schedule and everything was okay. But it is not always like that for me. And this week was a perfect example. So the following week just kicked my butt. I had a really tough time with a lot of diag. We're doing a lot of diag lately. It is gone from, 50% of the calls that we get to, I feel like later it's 3/4 of the calls that we get is diag. And there's a whole nother conversation. And I've had the conversation before about profitability, and there's a lot that goes into figuring out how to make money. But the plain and simple fact of it is there is a ton of it out there. I mean, we're turning certain things down, anything that's intermittent, anything like diesel performance or individual customers where they're not at a shop. We're turning all that stuff away. So, I mean, there's more work than what we even want to take on. Anyways, you can make money with this. That's another discussion. But with the diagnostics, with certain vehicles comes really challenging and sometimes time-consuming jobs. And you don't always see them coming. Sometimes you can recognize that ahead of time. But sometimes you go into it thinking, okay, well, I should be able to solve this pretty easily. And you don't. And it eats your lunch, or it screws up the rest of your day, or it really frustrates you. I had all those things happen this week. And I wanted to mention that just so that maybe somebody watches that YouTube video from last week and think, well, I could diagnose all those cars. None of that was too crazy. I, should maybe look into being, a mobile diagnostician. Right? Start doing mobile. We've had this discussion on the show before as well of what would you need to consider if you're going to do this. But the point that I wanted to drive home here and make clear is, boy, it is not always that straightforward, easy, and smooth. So I'm going to talk about a couple of vehicles here. Also, just going to talk about mindset a little bit this week. I was in like a pissed off mood, and it seemed like nothing was going right and everything was frustrated. And I think my team saw it too, because I really do have to consider that as a leader, business owner, is my attitude and demeanor is going to show to everybody, and they're going to reflect that in the way that they operate too. Like, I've got to consider exactly how my attitude is affecting everybody else. You can take that into consideration no matter what role you have within the shop, but especially as a leader, you have to be conscious of that. And this week was not my greatest. I put on the schedule for one of the trucks that I was looking at. I was like, stupid truck. That's all I put on the schedule, because I was pissed off this week and frustrated with just how everything went as a whole. But the vehicles being the main thing. And it's the saying of the problem isn't the problem, your attitude about the problem is the problem. And it's definitely true. Now, hey, can some things be more challenging than others? Yeah, that's it. That's what I signed up for. That's part of the gig. But that's, what I wanted to highlight here is things come in waves, and you might have a real smooth, nice day, and maybe you record that and put that on YouTube for everybody to see. But then the next week is not something that you want recorded. Let me talk about a couple of these cars. There was more in the week that was frustrating. I'm not going to bore you with all of those details, but I had a 2001, basically a GM motorhome, if you will. So if you look up the actual model, it is a Workhorse P30 chassis with a 6.5 diesel and a 4L80 transmission. Okay, and the transmission is what we were after. But this is a motorhome that had been converted into a food truck. Okay, and normally I would probably not get involved with something like this because it's just sort of out of my realm. Number one, I don't do diesel stuff. This was with the transmission. Okay, a 4L80. It's one of the earlier electric transmissions that GM used, going all the way back into the 90s. So it's pretty straightforward. Couple shift solenoids, speed sensors, nothing too crazy there. They were having issues with the transmission. Now, the reason I got involved with this is a shop that I do some work for. Decent shop. I like the guy who runs it. But the transmission was built by a local builder who we do all the programming for, and we work with them, and they get our number out to the people that they sell the transmissions to. So we have a very good relationship with this company. And they had sold this transmission to the shop to install. They're having issues with it. It's going into like a limp mode. It's not shifting correctly. They pulled the transmission back out, brought it back to this shop that built it. They went through it. They have a bench dyno system. They checked everything out. They're like, hey man, there's nothing wrong with this transmission. We can run it through all of the gears. There are no problems. Well, you put it in the truck and there are problems. So this is where I get involved, because I'm getting calls from both places actually. Like, hey, I've got this truck. Can you help me out? And then, hey, they've got this transmission they bought from us. They're having issues. They don't go out to the shop to check this out. They've done everything they can on the bench. Looks fine. Can you, help us figure this one out? Sure. Let's figure it out. Going into it, I didn't think it would be this difficult. But first things first, finding diagrams, finding component locations, that proved to be very challenging. I'm not in the world of motorhomes, and again, this is a food truck, but it's a conversion. I'm just not in that world, and I don't have service info. I should say I'm not used to finding service info on that. I didn't even know what to look it up as, because you can't, in All Day on Identifix, you can't look it up as a Workhorse P30. What I ended up finding was the thing to look for as far as diagrams, and this took me a while, was a C3500 with a 6.5. If I looked it up that way, I could actually get the correct diagram. And again, this is a 2001. Now, the other thing that I found, to get more information on the transmission itself, if you go back into the 90s, you can find more info. And I'll point out how I got to that point. But again, the GM vehicle, it's got an OBD2 port connector. I used my Tech 2 on this because I found with the heavier duty stuff, older stuff specifically, the Tech 2 does an excellent job of being able to communicate with everything correctly. Now, I did mention that it uses a OBD2 port. When you go in, you can only talk to a TCM. And I had to talk with the gentleman at the shop who does a lot of diesel stuff, and he was telling me that this 6.5 is basically, he said it's brainless, meaning that there's no module that needs to be in place to run this 6.5 diesel. It's a hot wire, and the rest of it's going to be mechanical. And so it really just has a TCM, has a module to run the transmission, and that's it. Okay, well, that's fine. Luckily, that's what we're after, so I can get in and talk to the TCM. Now, when I'm in the TCM, I have code 85 and 86, which are gear ratio codes. I eventually found out, but those are OBD1 codes. Those aren't OBD2 codes. And so if you look those up with a 2000, it doesn't really get you anywhere, because the 2000 is OBD2. The connector is OBD2. Okay, if I go back to 94, 95, pre-OBD2, and I look up the same truck, the same transmission, you can find those codes. That took me a little while to figure out, but then I could find the information on the code. And again, these are basically just gear ratio codes. So the next challenge, finding diagrams and then finding the component locations, that was also a bit of a challenge, but really the transmission, that's not hard to find. Once I have the diagram, I can locate the components based on wire color. Again, it's just a couple shift solenoids and speed sensors, easy enough. Good access underneath this thing. I can crawl right under there. The TCM was up under the dash, and I couldn't find a component location, but there's not a whole lot of modules on this thing, if any at all. And so there's the one TCM under there. I double checked the wire colors to verify that, yep, this is the module. And there's also a buffer box, and I'll explain what that is as we go. That's under the dash as well. So once I found my components, my next challenge was I needed to drive this thing. Now, I backed it back and forth in the parking lot, but this is a huge, big, it's a motorhome, right? Again, food truck, but motorhome. And I'm backing it up and forward into the parking lot, just looking to see, hey, am I missing any basics? Like, is there, a output speed sensor that's doing something weird, or input speed sensor is doing something weird? Okay. So when I first get there, and this is like an hour into it, just finding the component locations and figuring all this stuff out, right? It made for it my normal stops, I give myself an hour of time, and then I do as much as I can within that hour, make an assessment. If I have time in the day, I'll keep going. Maybe I'll revisit it after that hour's up. Like, I'm an hour into this thing, and I really haven't even started the diagnostics. Okay. So I'm backing it forward and back, and I'm watching the speed sensors just to see, is it registering anything? And the output speed sensor is not registering anything. Okay. And the tech was there, actually. They were watching the Tech 2. He's like, okay, yeah, that's probably where our issue is. Okay, let's figure this out. So I'm like, well, this is pretty straightforward. It's just a inductive pickup 2-wire sensor at the back of the transmission. Makes an AC voltage signal. Where that goes, according to the wiring diagram, is these 2 wires feed into a buffer box that's underneath the dash, which digitizes the signal, right? It takes an AC sine wave, and then it's going to convert it to a digital square wave that is then going to go to the TCM. What's interesting is this buffer box does that for the TCM, for the output speed sensor, but not for the input speed. And my assumption is the buffer box purpose is more for the speedometer, but for whatever reason, it doesn't digitize the input speed signal, just the output. Interestingly enough, I happened to notice that. But I do some measurements, I check some stuff, and what I end up finding is that there's no output voltage from the output speed sensor when I'm driving it around in the parking lot. Okay, so we look into it, I check the circuit. Circuit ends up being all good, and what I ended up finding is that output speed sensor was not seated properly into the back of the transmission. Now, this thing had just been built and apart, but it wasn't close enough to the tone wheel. Because I took the sensor out, waved some metal past it, I can see it generating voltage. Okay, what's going on here? And I just had to reseat that thing in the transmission, and then I got movement in it. So at that time, I thought I had it fixed. Okay, I got a couple hours into this thing here, but we got it figured out for him. Easy, let's move on with our day. Well, I get a call later in the day. It's like, hey, we went out and actually drove this thing. And my mistake for not taking it out onto the road, but honestly, I didn't want to. I didn't feel entirely comfortable driving this thing. I don't drive vehicles of that size very often, but more so than that, I would have driven it. Getting it out of this guy's parking lot was not something I was comfortable with because it was a really cramped parking lot with a lot of other vehicles in there. And again, just it's not my thing to drive around motorhomes. I just don't do it often, so I wasn't going to do it. And I figured, okay, well, hey, we've identified a problem and we fixed it. Let's move on. Well, he called me. He said, hey, once I drive this thing around, it's doing the same thing it was. It'll shift good for a little while, and then it'll go into like a limp mode, and then it will not shift out of third, I think is where it gets stuck, is in third gear. Once it's in the limp mode, you pull over, you shut it off, it goes normal, it'll shift maybe once, and then it'll set these codes, the 85 and the 86, and it's back to that same state. So I'm wondering, okay, maybe we got a sensor issue or something still with that output speed. I'm going to have to come back. Well, it was just a cluster. I went back the next day, and I was going to arrange it so one of them could drive it while I look at the data PIDs on the scan tool and maybe scope just to see what's going on. Well, they couldn't get somebody, even though we had arranged a time. So I wasted a trip out there. I was frustrated with the truck. We get back out there the next day. Okay, let's do this. Let's go for a ride. The other thing about this truck that I'll mention, and this is a food truck, so I don't know, maybe think twice about getting food from a food truck. There was so many flies in and around this thing. It was actually really gross, to be totally honest. When I was underneath it, I was looking at the transmission, the speed sensors and stuff like that. I caught something moving out of the corner of my eye while I was underneath it. I'm like, what is that? And I look over, and it's actually maggots crawling around on the grease that had like run underneath this thing. Now, far enough away, it wasn't like on the transmission or anything like that, but super, super gross. And I'm like, oh, like what's going on inside of this thing? Like how clean is the stuff as they're making the food? So I'm not going to out the food truck. Hey, if you're in the Minnesota area and you are wondering what food truck this is, text me. I'll send you the picture, but I would not be getting food from there. Anyways, the truck kind of grosses me out too. So I'm like, I really don't want to go back to this thing. And like I mentioned, I'm in a bad mood this whole week it just seems like everything, but I'm letting all this stuff affect me. So I'm pissed off about this truck. I don't want to go do it. I'm frustrated. I just want to get it over with. And it's affecting the way that I'm thinking about this thing and the way that I'm approaching it and what I'm doing. And, I wasted a trip out there. I'm like, I don't even want to be here in the first place. Anyways, push through it, make it happen, get it done. Let's figure this out. So we take it for a drive. We look at the Tech 2 while we're driving this thing. I'm graphing input speed, output speed. It calculates the gear ratio for you. And I actually have the what is known good as the gear ratios pulled up. I found that information by doing some digging, looking at it as like a 94. You can find it. And I'm watching this as we're driving, and everything looks perfect. But he does get it to go into its limp mode. It gets stuck in third gear. It won't downshift. It won't upshift. You're just kind of stuck in that one gear until you cycle the key. It'll shift once through the gears, sets that code again, 85, 86, gear ratio errors. Like, what the heck's going on here? Now, the right move here probably would have been scoping stuff at this point, but I didn't see anything on the scan tool to really point me towards like that I need to be scoping things, but I think that's where I would have found it. Instead, I reached out for a little bit of help. And, I've talked about on this show so many times about how having a network of people and people that are knowledgeable in one specific area of automotive that you can reach out to for help. And maybe you've helped them too, right? That's an important piece of that. It's not just you're calling people for help all the time. How have you helped that person to earn a call like, hey man, I need something. I need a favor. What can you help me out here? And luckily I have that, but you should work on that too, right? And that starts again with, well, what can you provide to that group of people or that person that earns you the right to ask for a favor when you need it? And I felt like I needed one here because I was just, again, in a bad state of mind going through this, didn't want to be working on it. And I'll be honest, I just wanted a silver bullet to get out of this thing. Luckily, I know a local transmission builder who's been doing this for a long time, like way back in the 90s when these things probably would have been a little bit more prevalent. And I called him and I told him the situation on what we're dealing with, what the shop had been through. I fixed an output speed sensor issue, but there seems to be more issues. I'm having trouble identifying why this thing's going into a limp mode when the sensors and the gear ratio appears to be fine. And he tells me, he's like, is there a little buffer box under the dash? I said, yeah. He's like, change that. He's like, I went through the exact same thing on a motorhome a few years back. It kicked my butt for like a month. We replaced that box and it fixed it. Something about the conversion from the AC signal to the digital signal into the TCM gets screwed up in that box. Replacing that fixed the issue. Get one of those. And I said, okay. I will do that. I didn't pull out the Pico again. Driving this thing was an event. So I didn't go back out and scope it. Probably would have been the right move. Be interesting to see exactly what it is. But I said, hey, let's get one of these buffer boxes. I don't know where you'll find one. It's about the size of the palm of your hand. A little white box with one plug in on it. Plug that in. See if that takes care of your problem. Call me back if not. So who knows? Maybe I'll be back on it next week. But my transmission guy sounded very confident that we had the exact same thing going on, and that's what fixed it for him. I'll take the silver bullet and move on from that one. So that was one this week. And had I recorded all of that, maybe it would have been interesting. Maybe not. But it's a far cry from everything that I dealt with the other day that I did record. So the other one, this one's still unresolved. And man, this one is frustrating. And I actually will probably follow up with this one when I get it figured out. I'm going back on Monday. This is a 2017 Honda CR-V. And this one kicked my butt this week. I had 2 separate trips in there, and I had Steve look at it for a while because it was one, again, not having a great week. And I'm like, Steve, can you just put eyes on this and tell me what you think? See if you can catch something that I'm overlooking or think about it differently than I'm thinking about it. But this was, again, 2017 Honda CR-V. First year they had the 1.5 turbo engine. Shop had done a cylinder head for compression-related misfire. All right, so it was a valve issue. They were saying they sent the head out to the machine shop. They put the cylinder head back on, and now it will not start, or it starts and stalls sometimes. They have replaced a number of components after the fact to try to get this thing to run. Double check the timing. They ended up putting new injectors in it, along with a few other components. They can't get this thing to go. That's where I came in. So first thing I do, of course, is check compression, check timing. As far as I can tell, everything's right on the money. I was able to find a known good cam crank, matches up. Compression matches spec. In-cylinder waveform looks great. So I'm going through the motions. And what between me and Steve actually figured this out, if you crank it and you floor the accelerator, you can actually get this thing to start and run. I didn't realize that my first trip. I was feathering the throttle and I would get it to kind of start and stumble a little bit, but that was about it. Mostly it was just a crank no start. Fuel pressure is there. Fuel quality is there. I checked for restricted exhaust, not the problem. Mass airflow, not the problem. Major vacuum leak, smoke the intake, not the problem. All the temp sensors read correctly. Went through the gambit of testing. Like, we got to be missing something. Air, fuel, spark, basics. What are we missing? Wasn't able to come to any reasonable conclusion the first trip out there. So I was like, I'll come back to it. And I had Steve go back in the meantime, just because he was at that shop for another programming. I said, hey, just take a look at that. And he was able to find out if you floor the accelerator while cranking and then feather the throttle, you can actually keep this thing running. It will run, and it will run halfway decent, but you have to keep it above $2,000 and you have to feather the throttle. Like, you can bring it up right up to the rev limiter, but you have to feather the throttle and keep it above $2,000. If it drops below $2,000, doesn't matter what you do with the throttle, it will shut off. If you start it, it will idle, and this was once it got warm. It will idle for a short period of time and shut off. Doesn't matter what you do with the throttle. The throttle is moving. We verified that. So Steve wasn't able to come to any conclusions either. He wasn't sure exactly what was going on. He was suspecting something maybe with the throttle body. The shop actually put a used one on there to see if that would fix it. And they were kind of messing with it in between us being there. They smoked the intake too. They unplugged the MAF sensor and disconnected the tube at the throttle just to put it into like a speed density mode. It does the exact same thing. I get back there for another visit, which was yesterday. That was Friday. And I get it. So it's running and I'm looking at everything, trying to figure out what the heck's going on. I'm looking at air fuel ratio sensor and oxygen sensor to try to gauge like what is the status of the engine fuel related. And it's staying in an open loop, so it's not using fuel trims. Here's the other super frustrating thing about this car that I'm just flabbergasted by still. No codes at all at any point, right? Again, you can only keep this thing running with your foot on the gas all the time. If you let it off, it stalls out. It does not code at all. Nothing. And I'm just like, how is this possible? I double checked the compression on this thing. I double checked timing. I double checked fuel pressure and quality just to feel like, am I missing something? Is there diesel in this fuel? And I'm not seeing this, but the shop did say it ran before they did the cylinder head. So they caused something. Again, I'm going back over stuff that I've already looked at to try to figure out what's going on. Looking at the throttle and really trying to assess like, okay, mass airflow, is there something going on with that? It doesn't seem to be. Again, the only codes that I can get is if I unplug stuff and then it'll code for something, but it doesn't change my situation one way or another. The one thing that I noticed, and this is what I've got to get back to on Monday that I have not addressed yet, is the high pressure fuel system. So I noted that there was fuel pressure, and there is. If you look at the rail pressure, it's like 1400. Now, if you compare the desired and the actual pressure, they do not correlate. Now, what I'm wondering is what's normal, what's not. The high pressure fuel is always high based off the data PID that I'm seeing, like 1400 once this thing's running, right? And the desired, once you lower the RPM or lower the demand on the engine, is down around 600. But the pressure in the rail never comes down to that point. So it's almost like it can't control the fuel pressure. Now, is that cause or effect? And what I'm thinking is timing, of course, because the intake cam drives the fuel pump. And if you have an engine that's out of time somehow or another, it's not going to be able to build or release the pressure appropriately to get the level that it wants. I tried unplugging the regulator at the pump. Something to consider about GDI pumps is when you unplug the regulator, it will go to the lowest pressure. It will release all of it. In some, it will go to max pressure if the engine is running. From what I could tell on this Honda, it went to max pressure once you unplugged it. Here's another interesting thing, something I noticed. I could not start it when I unplugged it, and the rail pressure goes to max line pressure. You plug it in, you can get it going. Again, you have to work that throttle. And the pressure comes down a little bit. It's still really high in regards to what it's desired on the scan tool. Now, why it's not coding for this, I don't know. I was actually going to do some reading on those data pins to make sure I'm looking at them correctly. But what I found was when you would stab the throttle and demand some load out of the engine, you'd see the desired go up to around where the actual fuel pressure is, and it would run okay. And then as soon as you'd let off the throttle, the desired comes down, but the actual stays high. It never comes off of this 1400 once it's running. Before you start it, it's not up at 1400. It needs the motion from the camshaft, but it never comes down. And it stalls. And when I unplug it, it goes to max pressure. It doesn't start. I feel like I have an issue there, but I ran out of time on Friday and I had to move on to other money-making vehicles. Of course, I'm going to charge for my time, but I have to have an answer before I charge for my time. That's how I operate. I know that's not exactly everybody's mode. They're going to charge every single time that they come out, charge for their time. I get that. And I will charge for my time, but not until I have an answer. I have to provide them with a solution in order to charge them for the time that I've spent on the vehicle. That's my personal decision on how I operate. But I had to move on to some other things. So what I think I need to address is this fuel pressure issue. It's the one thing that I have seen, scan tool data or engine related, that doesn't correlate, doesn't make sense. Now, I double check the timing, right? And according to the cam sensors and the crank sensor, everything's in line. And the compression is right where it should be, and the compression waveform looks great. But is there something going on with the timing in reference to the lobes for the high pressure fuel pump where it's not able to properly release the pressure, right? Because if it doesn't activate the solenoid at the correct time in relation to where that pump is pumping, it can't release the pressure and you get always high rail pressure. Why it's not coding for that, I don't know. I feel like that's the issue that I've got to go after. And I'm trying to keep in mind this is something that they caused because it ran before. But I don't have an answer yet. And that was just part of my frustrating week. And I really honestly believe, and this is me on Saturday reflecting on my week, that my attitude that I had last week was really hindering me in a lot of cases, right? Like, you get pissed off because things are going shitty, and you being pissed off makes more of your life shitty. I honestly believe that, but I lived it this week. And that's kind of a hindsight reflection, but it's something I need to remember going into next week when I'm going to go and I'm going to solve this thing. I'm going to figure it out. And how do you get out of that? It's easy to say, sitting here on a comfortable, Saturday afternoon, but in the moment when you got a lot of stuff to do and you've got a lot of stress, you've got a lot of demands and you're just frustrated, like, how do you get out of it in the moment? It's not an easy thing. But reflecting on your week or your day or the car you just worked on, I think is an important thing for all of us to do at one point or another and really see, did I handle that situation the best? Could I have handled it better? What part of that problem was me and what part of the problem was the car? How do I move on from that? So again, just a couple of points I wanted to make in regards to the last week. Number one, it's not always as easy as it may seem when I present some of these things, especially a lot of the case studies in hindsight. And the problem isn't the problem. Your attitude about the problem is the problem. And I'm going to carry that with me into next week. So hopefully that's interesting. Hopefully that's helpful. Hey, I really appreciate everybody reaching out, feedback about the show. I try to get back to everybody at one point or another. It may be slightly delayed. I'm not ignoring you, just busy, but I do make an effort to get back to everybody. So keep that coming. I'm going to be at ASTA or ASTE in North Carolina in a couple of weeks here. So if you're going to be there, hit me up on Facebook or Messenger, or just yell at me if you see me. Let's hang out, have a beer. It should be a good weekend. I'm looking forward to it. Other than that, let's get out there, start fixing the world one car at a time.
Bye.